1,200 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, a team of deep-sea divers and naval historians is in search of the greatest warship ever built. 60 years ago in these same waters, the Japanese battleship Yamato was destroyed by American air power. Her secrets were lost. Until now.
This is a symbol.
Was the Yamato really the most advanced warship of her time? And what was the truth behind her fatal mission? Somewhere in this twisted mass of steel and iron are the clues that could unravel one of the most enduring mysteries of World War II. In the port of Kure, southern Japan, a modern-day shipyard turns out some of the world's most advanced container ships. But some 60 years ago, this busy dockyard was the birthplace of World War II's most fearsome naval superweapon. Conceived in total secrecy, she was the most lethal battleship ever built, the Yamato. The Yamato was rumored to be twice the size of her American counterparts, with the biggest guns ever mounted on a warship. She was thought unsinkable, but no one expected that the pride of the Imperial Navy would have to face the enemy alone. World War II was drawing to an end. By April 1945, Japan's cities were the target of daily attacks by vast fleets of Allied bombers. Her once great armed forces were struggling to hold back the Americans' advance toward the home islands. With the enemy approaching, the desperate Japanese commanders unleashed a fearsome new weapon. Squadrons of kamikaze pilots were sent against the American fleet. In a few deadly weeks, these suicide pilots introduced a new sort of terror to modern warfare. The Japanese commanders then raised the stakes of suicide combat even higher. Drastic orders were dispatched to the naval base at Kure, commanding a new, unprecedented act of martyrdom. The greatest battleship ever built was ordered to sail unprotected directly into the overwhelming 1,500-ship American fleet advancing toward Japan.
作戦というようなもんじゃないんですね。日本の当時の感情としては、いわば死ぬることが美だというようなね。
さあ私はもう海軍に入っても職業軍人としてね、いつ死んでもように覚悟は決めておりましたわよね。それは。
Before dawn of the 7th of April 1945, the 3,000 men of the battleship Yamato left Japanese home waters on the most desperate kamikaze mission of World War II. April 7th, 1945. At first light, American fighters and dive bombers from a half-dozen aircraft carriers scramble into action. The Americans had spotted the advancing Yamato, Japan's last great warship. Over 400 planes raced to intercept her.
Instead of any kind of fancy maneuvers, we just got over to the target as close as we could and pushed straight over. And about 3,000 feet, bingo, we popped out of the base of the clouds and the ship was displayed in front of us. It was a perfect target.
私はもうトップに乗って もう私はもう石があって投げたいですよ。操縦桿に取るのが肉眼で見えるんですよ、もう人間。
We deployed everything at one shot, and I held on the trigger as long as I could, and got a few shots across the deck.
前鉄板をそれからペーンと私は無意識にこうするだけです。上艦部はみんな倒れております。機乗員が倒れております。爆弾が落ちても破片が飛びますからね。その繰り返しです。
Swarms of American fighter planes came at the Yamato from all directions.
その瞬間にもう再下艦場を降りた人間はもう一三金も水でもう水没ですよね。で私らの下艦板の兵員室には下からガーッと水があれよあれよに水が入ってきましてね。で艦内はもう電気はもう真っ暗だし、真っ暗な中でこれはもう完全にもうアウトだと思っとったんです。
血の海ですよ。もう手の飛んだまん食ったまんと多分まだ呼吸しとるんですよ。軍艦の中へは各部屋でアーマー閉めてしまいます。水が入った時に次の部屋上を及ぼさないように各部屋ごと仕切ってしまうわけですから。だからいかに戦争が残酷なもんであってそうなったわね。
Thousands of men were trapped below deck as the ship's watertight compartments were intentionally sealed shut.
本に誰かね軍刀で直筆したいと書いたこれも面白い美談として、そういう人はない思いますよ。少尉がね直筆したいと誰か本に載せておりますけど、これは私は信じがたいですよ。
船がぐらーっと横になったんです。主砲が3本あるんですけども、3本の一番左舷の1本がね水の中使っても見えなかったんです。
In the confusion, some officers gave orders to abandon ship.
でその飛び込む瞬間が、どういう瞬間だったかはあまり記憶にないんだけども大爆発したんです。でその音はいまだに覚えておるんです。
From 10 miles away, an American torpedo plane photographed the explosion and the last moments of the battleship Yamato. Japan's greatest ship and almost 3,000 of her crew seemed to have committed suicide. In lives lost, the sinking was one of the worst naval disasters in history. But from the moment the Yamato was lost, there has been controversy. Was the mission really suicidal? What caused the ship to explode? How did such a massive vessel sink so quickly? 200 miles south of Japan, an international crew of divers and naval historians is hoping to unravel the mystery of the Yamato's final mission.
皆さんヤマトをやるとなるともう夢中になっちゃうんですねみんな熱くなっちゃうんです。ですからそれが普通の関係ない人にもこの影響を及ぼすことによってヤマトはいつも時代でもその話題になっていくと。
French dive supervisor Paul Nargeolet will lead the descent onto the wreckage.
Yamato was a very secret ship. The Japanese crew, they want some answers because there is no full map of all the ship. And they were thinking, they heard about some stuff, but they were not really sure. There is no real evidence.
The dive team has brought along two of the world's most advanced submersibles. Each of these small submarines can descend as far as 3,000 feet. Their robot claws can recover small objects from the sea floor, and their glass bubbles provide a panoramic view. The 1,200-foot descent to the sea floor takes about 15 minutes.
When you dive for the first time on a wreck, I'm thinking about the people who were on board the ship, what happened to them. It's a strong feeling. very strong.
1,200 feet down, the sonar echoes point to a mass of metal lying on the bottom. The two craft maneuver toward the target. The sea floor is littered with so many cannon shells, it's certain they've found a warship. But 60 years ago, these waters were the site of many sinkings. The divers need to confirm that this is really the wreck of the Yamato. Like all great Japanese warships, the battleship Yamato had one distinguishing feature which was visible for miles. The imperial crest, a huge chrysanthemum shield protruded from her bow.
船は天皇陛下のものであるという思想があるわけですよ。ですからあれは菊の御紋章、あれを軍艦にはつけてるわけですよ。戦艦とか航空母艦とか巡洋艦とか大きな船にしかつけてないんですよね。大和の直径は2メートルあったんでね。
The researchers know that if they can find the chrysanthemum, they can identify the Yamato.
This is the symbol.
Yes, this is the symbol.
Yes. 菊の紋章を発見しました。菊の紋章を発見しました。
ちょっと聞き取りづらいのでもう一度お願いします。すみません。
Beautiful, huh?
Yes, beautiful.
To be sure they have the right ship, the submarine's robot claw positions a 2-meter-long plastic measuring rod next to the chrysanthemum.
Oh, it's great.
The Emperor's shield is exactly 2 meters in diameter. There is no question. The expedition has found the Yamato, the greatest ship of the Japanese Navy. The battleship Yamato was the world's most powerful warship. She was built at a time when battleships were the undisputed symbols of great nations' power. And when the Yamato sank just a few years later, her loss marked the end of the battleship as superweapon. These all-powerful warships had been made obsolete by the changing nature of war at sea. The purpose of a battleship is to deliver devastating fire from big guns at a great distance. The range of the guns is crucial. For the surface navy, if your ship can hit an enemy vessel while she is still too far away to fire back, you are effectively invulnerable. By 1904, battleships like those of America's Great White Fleet could fire their intimidating 12-inch guns as far as 7 miles. A new age of gunboat diplomacy was born. The Japanese Navy had been one of the first to understand the strength of the modern battleship. In May 1905, they fought the mighty Russian fleet at the Straits of Tsushima. The Japanese fleet sank 19 Russian ships in a single day.
Japan won great prestige as a result of the battle at Tsushima Straits. The Japanese were the first non-white power to be admitted to the circle of great powers, and it had been naval strength that, to a large measure, had gained Japan admittance to this exclusive club.
But it was an expensive club to join. In 1922, the Western powers signed a treaty limiting the size of their fleets. As the newest member of the fraternity, the Japanese were forced to go along.
There was a great deal of resentment in Japan because British and Americans were allowed to have 15 battleships each. The Japanese were only allowed 9.
それじゃあどうしたらいいかということになった時に、数ではアメリカかなわないから、じゃあ一つの軍艦の性能を強くしてアメリカに対して一隻で対応で複数の戦艦に対応できる能力を持とうというんで、これは絶対秘密にしなきゃいけないと。
There were rumors that the Japanese were building ships of unusual size, but the stories were dismissed by one United States Navy spokesman privately as, quote, Nipponese rodent propaganda, unquote. It's part of a pattern of underestimating the Japanese.
The construction of the world's largest, most powerful battleship began in complete secrecy at the port of Kure. To block the view from the outside, sailors stretched a mile of fishermen's netting around the largest dry dock in Japan. No one in Kure had access to the entire set of plans. Sakutaro Nishihata was one of the designers of the mysterious vessel.
図面板いうのがおりまして、そこへ返却して、その図面板の人が金庫にそれを収めて鍵かけて帰る。これ取り扱いこう墨で塗っておりますがね、ここに丸しと書いたハンコが押してあるわけですよ。世界一の船を作ったんだというのは戦後初めて分かっただけでね。
Today, our knowledge of the Yamato's design is fragmentary. Just a few drawings and a handful of photographs have survived. We do know that the scale of the Yamato was staggering, almost twice the displacement of any Allied battleship. Each of her 3 gun turrets weighed more than an entire American destroyer. Her main guns were designed to attack at an unprecedented range of 25 miles. At such a distance, the target would be invisible. Spotter planes would be needed to direct the fire over the horizon. The ship was intended to be one of the most advanced weapons systems of her time. The battleship Yamato joined the fleet in December 1941. To keep the ship's design secret, there was no public celebration at the port of Kure.
Because of our reading of Japanese signals traffic, American intelligence analysts realized that the new flagship of the combined fleet was named Yamato. Knowing the name was, of course, fine, but it told us nothing about the capabilities of the ship.
In Japan, the ship's name had a special, almost religious significance. The word Yamato was a poetic synonym for Japan itself.
大和へ来るのは一番トップでないと大和へ乗れなかったですから、もうあれにこう行ったらもう天狗みたいなもんですね。
大きいな思いまして、1日2日ほんまに自分の帰るとこわからんぐらいですわよね。みんなそういう感じです。絶対沈むことはない思って乗ったんです、みんなね。厚い鋼鉄で囲ってあるから大丈夫だ。
大和が沈むか日本が沈むかどっちかじゃいう、もう皆が船に乗っとる兵隊は全部そう感じ取りましたですからね。
But in spite of what her crew believed, the battleship Yamato was not unsinkable. As more of the vessel is revealed, it becomes clear to the divers that they have one of the largest shipwrecks of all time. The true scale of the vessel had once been a state secret.
もし知られたら自分がせっかく作ったものが旧式な兵器になってしまいますから、やっぱりそれはいけないということなんですね。大砲の大きさ、直径とかそういうものは船に乗ってる艦長も司令官も知らされてなかったんですね。
Japanese secrecy had proved to be ironclad. U.S. naval analysts believed that the Yamato was about the size of the new American battleships.
But the Yamato was really almost twice as large as the Americans thought. The ship had to be so large because she was built around her guns, the biggest guns ever mounted on a warship. Exploring the gaping hole left where a gun turret once rested, it becomes difficult to imagine the scale of the Yamato's firepower.
それを撃つ時にはラッパを吹いて撃つんですけど、そのラッパが鳴ると隠れてこうやっとらんともう大変だったんです。国家それぐらい2メーターも3メーターも飛ばされますから。
Firing 18-inch projectiles at supersonic speeds, with each shot weighing as much as an automobile, the Yamato's guns could punch a hole in armor almost 2 feet thick. To support the weight and recoil of such massive guns, the Yamato needed to be unusually wide. As a two-ocean navy, the width of American warships was limited by the locks of the Panama Canal.
The American designers had to struggle always with the problem that their battleships had to fit in the 110-foot wide locks of the Panama Canal. The biggest American battleships were 108 feet 6 inches wide, a very tight fit indeed.
But the Yamato didn't need the Panama Canal. She was designed to dominate the Pacific. The extra width allowed the Yamato to be fitted with the thickest ship's armor ever constructed.
船の長さに比べて幅が非常に大きいわけですよ。そうすると波の抵抗が大きいんで速力が落ちると。
For decades, naval architects had struggled to reduce resistance by experimenting with the shape of ships' bows. The width of the Yamato made such streamlining imperative.
パラフィンでね、模型を50隻作りまして、それを実験しまして、今のバルバスバブという発想が浮かんだようです。
で、アメリカの戦艦にもバルバスバウっていうのは取り入れられてる。だけどアメリカのやつは前にそんなに突き出てないんです。だからヤマトは初めてその3メートル突き出る球場を。
As it moves through the water, the bow of the ship creates a constant wave. The Yamato's bulb produced its own wave a few feet in front of the ship, which canceled out the wave generated by the ship itself. With less wave action, the drag of the water was reduced.
バルバスバウ、それが最高スピードにおいて 7%、8% のその増波抵抗を減らすから、27ノットって言われるけど28ノットぐらい出るんですね。
The expedition has located the Yamato's front section sitting upright on the ocean floor. The unique silhouette of the bow is clearly visible. Naval historians will finally be able to analyze the exact shape of the bulbous bow and learn its secrets. The vulnerability of battleships like the Yamato was first demonstrated when Japan's Navy attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. On the the morning of December 7th, 1941, hundreds of naval aircraft from a Japanese carrier force hit 8 American battleships while they sat at anchor. Then, only 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched another air attack off Malaya. Japanese aircraft easily overwhelmed the new British battleship Prince of Wales, while she was fully armed on the high seas.
This event was very shocking to professional naval opinion because the Prince of Wales was a new ship ready for action, and yet Japanese planes sank that ship in short order.
Within 3 weeks of their attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft had damaged or destroyed every Allied battleship in the Pacific Ocean. Japan had demonstrated to the world's navies how skillful use of air power could trump the battleship. Despite this overwhelming success, the Japanese still put their faith in the invulnerability of the Yamato.
私はね、本当はああいうところで太平洋上でね、アメリカの戦艦と打ち合いしたい、そればっかり願っとったんですよ。
But the days of pure battleship-to-battleship warfare were waning. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, and it was a contest of aircraft carriers. In June 1942, the U.S. Navy lured the Japanese into a trap and sent hundreds of its aircraft to take on their fleet. In just hours, Japan lost 4 of her carriers and over 330 aircraft. It was a defeat from which the Imperial Navy could never recover. During the battle, the Yamato functioned as a command center, but it stayed 300 miles over the horizon, beyond the range of American aircraft. After Midway, the Yamato lost the air cover which had been provided by Japan's 4 carriers. She was forced to retreat to the safety of Japanese bases. The crew waited and continued to prepare for a major battleship engagement, which never came.
The Japanese never committed the Yamato. They felt they could not risk an irreplaceable treasure. The Yamato, from the end of August 1942 until May of 1943, was at sea for 1 day.
Seldom leaving port, the sailors joked about being stationed on the Hotel Yamato.
一番楽なかったんですけどね、食事もほとんど麦飯は食べずに米の飯食べて、それで酒も飲み放題ようなあったですかね。
The battleship had become the Japanese Navy's most impressive white elephant. And while the Yamato sat in Kure Harbor, the Japanese Navy was losing the war. With great loss of life, American forces were retaking Japan's Pacific territories, island by island. Invading Tinian, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, step by step, the enemy was approaching the sacred home islands. By April 1945, Americans were poised to invade Okinawa, only 300 miles from Japan. Short of everything but human lives, the Japanese unleashed a secret weapon.
Kamikaze is the Japanese name for it. Fanatical death dives that are now the enemy's chief weapon. Aerial harakiri in a desperate attempt to smash our fleets.
Pilot Ed Sieber encountered his first kamikaze while attempting to land on the USS Bennington.
He was heading right down toward the fantail of our ship, I happened to be on the base leg of my carrier approach. I rolled out and I pulled the trigger. The ship's guns were firing. The kamikaze was hit. Part of the airplane landed on board our ship, scaring the life out of us. It was very awesome because, I mean, our psychology is not used to that idea.
沖縄にいる空母が問題ですから、愛国心というんですか、その狂信的な愛国心というか、その自分の家族ね、父、母、妹、自分の子供をその外国多民族における戦いにおいては守らなきゃいけないと。
Most of the kamikaze pilot volunteers were university students. Those science students were deemed too valuable to sacrifice.
新聞はそれをドラマチックにその公表しますよね。そうするとやっぱり集団暗示じゃないんですけど、だんだんそういう気持ちっていうのがこう称賛されて。
400 miles north of Okinawa, the Yamato sat in the relative safety of Kure Harbor. Its young officers knew that the kamikaze pilots were fighting a decisive battle only a day's sail away.
ただいま3号機、今で突入し、飛行機が電報を撃ってきます。海南拡声機でかかめ電報を撃ってきます。我々今で突入するって。手をして拝むんですよ、今ぶつかったの思いです。必ず撃ってくる、特攻機。
By the spring of 1945, the kamikaze had hit 300 ships, killing thousands of American sailors. Even the wholesale sacrifice of the suicide pilots didn't stop the American advance. But for the Japanese, the deaths recalled a tradition of ritual suicide, a willingness to die for honor. Here, perhaps, was an invisible weapon, unique to Japan. While the Americans battled the kamikaze on the approaches to Okinawa, another battle was raging at Japanese naval headquarters. An air raid on Tokyo had left 1 million people homeless. The smell of death was everywhere. In such an atmosphere, how could the Navy fail to commit its greatest ship to the battle? Even a battle which could not be won.
もう一線電信で油がない、それで沖縄がああいう状態になったでしょ。行くとこはないですか、沖縄しか。
The same commanders who had organized the young kamikazes prepared secret orders for an even more desperate plan. With virtually no air cover, the Yamato would sail toward the hundreds of enemy warships approaching the beaches of Okinawa. If her big guns did not sink the enemy, she was to ram them. Her crew would fight the Americans to the death, using their sidearms, their flare guns, or even their bare hands.
当然常識として沖縄まで行ったって飛行機にやられちゃうんだから大和はたどり着けないということは分かってるんですけど、大和は3000人の乗員がいるわけですけど、それを一瞬にして死ぬわけですよね。海軍としてはその沖縄が取られてしまったらもう戦争に勝てないことは分かってるんですけど、特攻隊が飛行機がアメリカに向かって飛び立って自爆していくわけですね。自爆して体当たりいくわけです。多くの兵隊が死んでるのに、じゃあ一番戦力になる大和は何もしなくてもいいのかと。日本海軍と戦う威力、ベンツを保つためにも最大の戦力である大和というものを使おうということになったんですね。
当直士官の注意事項として、これで帰ってこれるかどうかは分からんけども、そういう作戦の内容は絶対に話をしてはいけないと。身辺の整理を全部して、借金払いもあるでしょうしね、そういう身辺を整理して帰ってこいと。
長男が3月の12日生まれとるんですね。一晩生まれて一晩見ただけですよ。それで出ていく時に もう最後だ帰れないことは分かっておりますから、今までで朝帰る時に言ってくれた金井が銀行までどうぞ送ってくれ、その時も送ってくれたけれども、もう一回回ってみて最後の別れして船へ帰りました。
Late in the afternoon, the crew of the Yamato assembled on deck.
まだね、日は完全には沈んでなかったと思うんですが、総員集合で全部上艦前集まって、副長の命令で皇居擁廃して、
戦友と握手して、今度会う時安子神社で会おうってみんながんだからそうな握手してでやったんで別れたんで、そして軍歌を歌ったんです。普段歌う軍歌。いかに恐怖吹きまくも、たとえ敵艦をくとも、大和魂みじる我らの願
There were squalls in the China Sea the night the Yamato sailed. These lines of low clouds would make it harder for enemy aircraft to spot the ship. The battleship and its small task force hugged the coast as they proceeded south. Miles away, across the dark ocean, a screen of destroyers protected the Yamato from submarines. Nothing could protect her from an attack by air. Below deck, on what might be the last night of their lives, the crew was allowed to indulge.
副長の号令で各分隊がみんなそこへね、酒を受け取りに行って、でまあそれでも結構酒を飲んでおりゃ酔っ払いますよね。士官とか下士官はね、あまり酔っ払ってなかったです。
まあ酒ビールはね、みんな車座になって飲んだわけですわね。だけどそら飲めるもんじゃないですよ、そらね。
In the hours before dawn, the Yamato maintained its course straight toward the 1500 ship American fleet.
弱くなったら最後まで頑張り100な150の力出します。それこそ大和魂を発揮して最後まで。
The next morning, the first planes intercepted the Yamato while she was still 200 miles from the closest American warship. The ship's lumbering 18-inch guns attempted to fire on the approaching aircraft from 10 miles out, but the low clouds prevented accuracy. Once the first dive bombers penetrated the 10-mile screen, the Yamato's 100 anti-aircraft guns let loose. But almost all the planes made it into position, 20,000 feet directly over the ship. The first 500-pound bombs landed on the deck, and fires broke out.
The dive bombers would strike from high above and try to put bombs through the deck armor. Fighters would strafe the battleship to reduce the effectiveness of the Japanese anti-aircraft fire. The killer, though, would be the torpedoes.
It was the job of the airdrop torpedoes to penetrate the Yamato below the waterline near the bow and stern, where her armor was the thinnest.
Like the torpedo pilots used to say, if you want holes in the deck, send the dive bombers. If you want them sunk, send us.
The aviators were told to torpedo her only on one side, flooding her on that side, leading the ship to capsize.
After a dozen torpedo hits, even the Yamato's 1,000 watertight compartments couldn't save her. The lower decks flooding fast, the battleship was doomed. A pair of the attacking planes photographed the destruction, while the rest of the 400 American aircraft turned home to rejoin their carriers. How could a huge ship with so many watertight compartments sink in less than an hour? What caused the great explosions caught in the final photos of the battle? By studying the wreckage, the researchers worked to reconstruct the Yamato's final moments. On the ocean floor, the hull of the ship sits in two huge pieces. The 3,000-ton gun turrets lie upside down in the silt. The jagged metal points to a sudden, violent death. It becomes clear that the wreck has been torn apart by the massive explosions. These were far more powerful than the blasts of torpedoes.
その写真で爆発したところは残ってるんですけど、どんな状態で沈んだかというのはこれまで分からなかったんですね。大和の沈んだものを克明に記録していますと、大和の沈没のですね、状況を裏付けるように横たわっているのが記録されたということが重要な発見だと思うんですけど。
Flooded on one side by torpedo hits and bomb blasts below deck, the doomed ship listed to port until she became unstable. As she capsized, the gun turrets were ripped from their mountings by their own weight and plunged into the sea. In the powder magazines, tons of ammunition slammed together, causing at least 3 more powerful blasts, perhaps the largest explosions ever to occur at sea. The ship was torn into 2 parts and came to rest 1,200 feet below. For the American Navy, the destruction of the world's most powerful warship had proven to be a methodical affair, a mere footnote in the battle for the Pacific.
The sinking of the Yamato was noted with satisfaction in the headquarters of Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, but the notice was brief. The Yamato was the only ship left that could cause us problems, and now she was down.
For the Japanese, the sinking spelled the end of the Imperial Navy.
海底のですね、残骸となった大和を見たときはやっぱり何とも言えないそういうのが実感です。船が沈んだってことは乗員にとって墓場と。大和の残骸はやっぱりあれは海の男の墓場であるという具合に実感しました。
A picture frame, a bugle, and a porcelain bowl are some of the remains of the Yamato's final day. These are recovered and preserved so that the ship will not be forgotten. The few sailors who made it off the sinking ship do not need reminders.
円が5メーターぐらいのスクリューですから、いっぺん回ればものすごい渦ができるわけですよね。その渦に巻き込まれてもがけばどうしようがもう全然潜ったままでね。
泳いでも浮揚感からもう手離そうかも
離れたところでポカッと浮き上がったんです。で目の前がわーっと明るくなったからあらっと思って目を開けたら上に青空が見えるじゃないですか。
もがいと何本もがいて上上がらんから苦しんどったらちょうどせがれがパッと出てきましたね。岩盤に顔まで吹いか泳いで吹いたことを今でもはっきり記憶しております。だから今でもお前が巻いとらんだわしは死んどるあの時に。
Expecting to sacrifice their lives, the 260 survivors were surprised to be picked up by a Japanese destroyer.
生き延びたい思い欲が出てきましたね。生き延びたい。それ1年ですからね。初めて生き延びたい思いましたね。今で言うせがね、その時初めて戦争は怖い思った。
For weeks, the Japanese Navy refused to acknowledge that the Yamato had been lost with 3,000 men. The survivors were taken to a bombed-out port facility, where they were hidden away. A month after the sinking, those who remained were finally allowed to return to their families.
もうこの死んだ思うとし、 五体満足であちこち焼いておりますけど、別に足が飛んでるわけはないし、なんとかチンバ引いてびっくり戻りましたけどね。嬉しかったと思いますよ。残念に思い、一時は思ったけど、いつまでも思わない。
In terms of human life, the sinking of the Yamato was one of the greatest naval disasters in history. The largest battleship ever built was conceived less as a practical weapon than as a symbol of national prestige. When the Yamato left on her final suicidal mission, the admiral spoke of honor and immortal glory. But no one speaks for the thousands of men entombed in her wreckage. We do not know their thoughts as they died. By the end of World War II, the aircraft carrier had replaced the battleship as the floating symbol of national might. In the 60 years since the Yamato was lost, no nation in the world has chosen to construct another battleship.